In the world of human relationships, the line between friendship and betrayal can be as thin as a razor's edge. What happens when obsession takes over reason and desire clouds judgment? This is the story of how a friendship triangle turned into a tragic love triangle, leading three lives down a path of no return. It all began on a quiet autumn morning in the suburbs of London. Fresh air and the smell of fallen leaves filled Oakwood Street, a picturesque street lined with well-kept Victorian homes. The neighbors began their daily routine, oblivious to the storm that was about to break out at number 17. Suddenly, the silence was brutally interrupted by the echo of police sirens. The curious looked out their windows, intrigued and alarmed, as a procession of patrol cars stopped in front of the Thompson residence. The Thompson house, an elegant red brick structure with large windows and a manicured front garden, had always been a source of admiration in the neighborhood. Now, surrounded by yellow police tape and uniformed officers, she had become the epicenter of a mystery that would shake the foundations of this seemingly idyllic community. Mark and Sarah Thompson were the epitome of success and marital happiness. Mark, a 35-year-old marketing executive, was known for his charisma and his ability to close million-dollar deals. Tall, with well-combed brown hair and piercing green eyes, he always wore impeccable tailored suits. Sarah, for her part, was a talented 32-year-old architect whose natural talent for design had led her to work on some of London's most prestigious projects. With her long blonde hair, slender figure, and radiant smile, she was the envy of many and the dream of many others. The couple had moved to London from New York 3 years earlier, looking for a change of scenery and new professional opportunities. Their arrival in the neighborhood had been greeted with enthusiasm, and they quickly integrated into the social life of the community. They hosted elegant dinners, attended charity events, and always had time for a friendly chat with their neighbors. From the outside, the Thompsons seemed to have it all: professional success, love, beauty, and a bright future ahead of them. However, behind the curtains of her impeccable Victorian home lurked a web of secrets and lies that was about to unravel in the most tragic way possible. And at the center of this web was James Hartley, Mark's best friend, and the unwitting catalyst for a series of events that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. James Hartley was a 34-year-old freelance photographer, known for his work in fashion and travel magazines. With his bohemian look, stubble, and deep blue eyes, James was Mark's polar opposite in many ways. While Mark represented corporate success, James embodied the free and artistic spirit. This difference, far from separating them, seemed to be the basis of a solid and complementary friendship. The Thompsons had met James shortly after moving to London. They met at an art exhibition at the Tate Modern, where James was presenting some of his photographs. The connection was instant. Mark was fascinated by James' stories of travel and adventure, while Sarah was attracted to his artistic sensibility and different way of seeing the world. From that moment on, the three formed an inseparable trio. Over the next few months, James became a constant presence in the Thompsons' lives. They shared dinners, nights out, and weekends in the English countryside. James was Mark's confidant on work matters, and Sarah's partner in long conversations about art and architecture. To any outside observer, the dynamic between the three was that of a perfect and balanced friendship. However, beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, feelings were brewing that would threaten to destroy everything. James, unintentionally, began to develop a stronger and stronger attraction toward Sarah. At first, he tried to ignore these feelings, attributing them to simple admiration for her beauty and intelligence. But as time went by, this attraction transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. Every gesture from Sarah, every smile, every moment shared was etched in James' mind with overwhelming intensity. He found himself thinking about her constantly, imagining a life together, fantasizing about moments he knew could never be. Guilt gnawed at him, knowing that these thoughts were a betrayal of his friendship with Mark. He tried to distance himself, immerse himself in his work, even date other women, but nothing could erase the image of Sarah from his mind. The situation came to a head during a trip the three took to Paris to celebrate the Thompsons' wedding anniversary. James had been invited as the official photographer for the trip, a perfect excuse to be close to the couple in intimate moments. While capturing images of Mark and Sarah in front of the Eiffel Tower, kissing in the evening light, James felt a pang of jealousy so intense that he almost dropped his camera. That night, in the solitude of his hotel room, James faced the harsh reality of his feelings. He could no longer deny it. He was in love with his best friend's wife. Guilt and desire waged a constant battle inside him, driving him to the brink of madness. He knew he had to do something, make a decision before the situation got out of hand. But the fear of losing both Mark's friendship and Sarah's presence in his life paralyzed him. Meanwhile, oblivious to James' internal torment, Mark and Sarah continued with their seemingly perfect life. However, not everything was rosy in the Thompson marriage. As their careers took off, the time they spent together became increasingly shorter. Romantic dinners had become quick meals in front of the television, and deep conversations had been replaced by discussions about schedules and work commitments. Mark, in particular, had become increasingly absent. His job at the marketing agency kept him busy late into the night, and business trips had become more frequent. Sarah, although successful in her career, was beginning to feel alone and neglected. In this context of increasing emotional distance, James' constant and attentive presence became increasingly comforting to her. One day, while Mark was out of town on business, James decided he couldn't take the pressure anymore. He invited Sarah to have coffee, with the intention of confessing his feelings and putting an end to this unsustainable situation. They met at a small cafe in Notting Hill, far from their usual haunts to avoid awkward encounters with acquaintances. James, nervous and with trembling hands, began to speak. He told Sarah how much he admired her, how her presence lit up every room, how her laugh was music to his ears. And finally, with a broken voice, he confessed that he had fallen madly in love with her. Sarah listened silently, her blue eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in front of her. When James finished speaking, there was a moment of silence that seemed to last an eternity. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. To James' surprise and horror, Sarah admitted that she also felt a special connection to him, something that went beyond friendship. However, in the same breath, he categorically stated that he would never betray Mark. She loved her husband, she said, and although their marriage was going through a difficult time, she was committed to making it work. This moment of shared vulnerability, rather than providing closure, only intensified James's obsession. Sarah's confession, although accompanied by rejection, had planted a seed of hope in his mind. If she felt something too, he reasoned, maybe in time he could convince her that they were meant to be together. From that moment on, James began to meticulously plan how he could be with Sarah. His mind, clouded by obsession, constructed elaborate scenarios in which Mark disappeared from the equation. What began as fantasies soon turned into concrete, dark and dangerous plans. James began to subtly manipulate situations to create more opportunities to be alone with Sarah. He offered to help her with architectural projects, knowing that Mark would be too busy to accompany her. He organized group outings that, coincidentally, ended with him and Sarah chatting late into the night while the others left early. At the same time, James began to plant doubts in Sarah's mind about their marriage. He would make seemingly innocent comments about how hard Mark worked, or how little he seemed to appreciate Sarah's talent. Every little complaint or frustration Sarah shared about their relationship was amplified and used by James to paint Mark as a negligent and selfish husband. Meanwhile, oblivious to the approaching storm, Mark continued to blindly trust his friend. He even confided his concerns about his marriage to James, unaware that he was fueling the fire of the man's obsession who planned to destroy him. Mark was talking about the growing distance between him and Sarah, how he felt like they were becoming strangers under the same roof. James listened intently, offering words of comfort while inwardly rejoicing at every crack in the Thompsons' relationship. The tension in this emotional triangle continued to grow for months. Sarah, caught between her loyalty to Mark and her growing feelings for James, became increasingly distant and melancholic. Mark, consumed by his work and increasingly aware of the problems in his marriage, was beginning to show signs of stress and anxiety. And James, driven by his obsession, became bolder and more careless in his pursuit of Sarah. The situation reached a boiling point during a dinner at the Thompson home. It was a Friday night, and Mark had managed to leave work early to host a surprise dinner for Sarah, hoping to reconnect and save their marriage. He had invited James, thinking that his friend's presence would help create a relaxed and familiar atmosphere. Dinner began pleasantly, with the three of them chatting animatedly about future projects and funny anecdotes. But as the night progressed and the wine flowed, the atmosphere began to change. James, unable to contain his emotions any longer, began to make increasingly daring comments, bordering on the limit of what was appropriate. His eyes never left Sarah, and every time she laughed or smiled, he leaned closer, as if he wanted to take in every detail of her face. Mark, at first oblivious to the growing tension, eventually began to notice something strange about his friend's behavior. The way James looked at Sarah, the way his hand took a second too long to pass the salt to her, the intensity with which he listened to every word she said. An uneasy feeling began to grow in Mark's stomach. The decisive moment came when Sarah got up to bring dessert from the kitchen. James immediately offered to help her, and Mark, on impulse, decided to accompany them. Walking into the kitchen, Mark froze at the door. James was standing very close to Sarah, his hand resting gently on her back as he whispered something in her ear. The intimacy of the moment was undeniable. Mark felt like the ground was opening beneath his feet. In that instant, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in his mind. Sarah's unexplained absences, the furtive glances between her and James, the growing discomfort she had felt in her friend's presence. Everything took on a new and terrible meaning. Unable to contain himself, Mark burst into the kitchen, startling Sarah and James. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage and pain. Sarah, pale and visibly nervous, tried to explain that it was not what it seemed. James, for his part, tried to remain calm, assuring Mark that they were just having a friendly conversation. But Mark wasn't about to accept excuses. Years of suppressed suspicions and unspoken doubts burst forth in that moment. He accused Sarah of infidelity and James of betrayal. The words flew like poisoned darts, hurting everyone present. Sarah tearfully denied having been unfaithful, while James attempted to mediate, which only fueled Mark's anger further. The argument escalated quickly, with accusations flying back and forth. Sarah, overwhelmed by the situation, tried to leave the kitchen, but Mark grabbed her arm, preventing her from leaving. In a moment of blind rage, Mark lost control and pushed Sarah harder than he intended. She stumbled back, losing her balance, and fell, hitting her head against the edge of the marble countertop. The sound of impact was followed by a deafening silence. Sarah lay motionless on the ground, a trickle of blood beginning to form around her head. Mark and James froze, unable to process what had just happened. Seconds stretched like hours as the reality of the situation slowly settled into their minds. Mark was the first to react. He knelt next to Sarah, calling her name with a trembling voice, but she didn't respond. His hands shook as he searched for a pulse, silently praying to find some sign of life. James, still in shock, watched the scene as if he were a spectator in a nightmare from which he could not wake up. When Mark finally looked up at James, his eyes were filled with panic and desperation. "She's dead," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh God, I've killed her." The reality of what had just happened fell on both men like a slab of lead. At that critical moment, Mark's mind went into survival mode. Instead of immediately calling 911, she made a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. With a trembling but determined voice, he told James, "No one can know this. We have to get rid of the body." James, still stunned by the events, tried to reason with Mark. "We can't do this," he argued. "We have to call the police, explain that it was an accident, But Mark was beyond reason. The fear of losing everything he had built, of being seen as a murderer, clouded his judgment. "If anyone finds out, our lives are ruined," Mark insisted. "Think about your career, your future. No one will believe it was an accident." James, torn between his sense of duty and his loyalty to Mark, finally relented. With a lump in his throat, he nodded silently. The next few minutes passed in a flurry of silent, desperate activity. Mark and James meticulously cleaned the kitchen, removing any traces of blood. They wrapped Sarah's body in a tarp they found in the garage and loaded it into the trunk of James' car, taking advantage of the darkness of the night to avoid being seen by the neighbors. They drove for hours, deep into the dense forest that surrounded the city. Finally, in a remote clearing, they dug a shallow grave and buried Sarah's body. While they covered the ground with leaves and branches to hide the disturbance, both men remained in a silence full of guilt and remorse. Back at the house, Mark and James agreed on their alibi. They would say that Sarah had gone for a walk after dinner and never returned. Mark would report her missing the next morning, acting like the worried husband who had no idea where his beloved wife might be. What Mark didn't know was that James, racked with guilt and obsession, had made a different decision that night. While Mark concentrated on cleaning up the last of the evidence in the house, James had secretly kept Sarah's wedding ring and a lock of her hair. These macabre memories would be the beginning of a twisted plan that James was just beginning to formulate in his disturbed mind. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Mark, playing the role of the heartbroken husband to perfection, reported Sarah missing to the police. He launched emotional appeals on television, pleading with anyone who might have information about his wife's whereabouts to come forward. James, for his part, remained close, offering support and comfort to his friend while he internally struggled with his own guilt and growing delusions. The police investigation was quickly launched. The detectives assigned to the case, Inspector Jack Reynolds and his partner, Detective Sergeant Elena Sanchez, began to unravel the Thompsons' lives. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and friends, trying to build a clear picture of Sarah's latest movements and her relationship with Mark. At first, the image they got seemed to support Mark's version. Neighbors spoke of the Thompsons as a model couple, although some mentioned hearing occasional arguments in recent months. Sarah's co-workers described her as dedicated and passionate about her work, with no obvious signs of personal problems. However, as the investigation progressed, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Inspector Reynolds noted that Mark seemed too controlled for a man whose wife had just disappeared. His emotional appearances on television did not match his more reserved behavior during police interrogations. Sergeant Sanchez, for her part, focused on James. He was intrigued by the photographer's closeness to the couple and his constant presence with Mark during the investigation. During her interviews with James, she noticed how his gaze wandered every time he mentioned Sarah, and how his hand shook slightly when talking about the night of the disappearance. Meanwhile, James struggled with his own demons. Guilt over his role in Sarah's death and the subsequent cover-up consumed him. He spent entire nights awake, reliving the events of that fateful night. In his darkest moments, he would pull out the ring and the lock of Sarah's hair, caressing them as he murmured promises of eternal love. James's obsession with Sarah, far from diminishing with her death, seemed to have grown to monstrous proportions. He began to have visions of her, believing that her spirit visited him at night. In his deranged mind, these visits were a sign that Sarah had chosen him over Mark, even in death. As the weeks passed without significant progress in the investigation, the pressure on Mark increased. The media, which had initially portrayed him as the image of the devoted husband, began to question his version of events. Rumors surfaced about possible problems in the marriage, and some tabloids even hinted that Mark could be involved in Sarah's disappearance. James, watching his friend crumble under the pressure, began to consider a terrible idea. If Mark were arrested for Sarah's murder, he reasoned, he would be cleared of suspicion and could honor Sarah's memory without interference. Plus, a twisted part of his mind saw this as a way to punish Mark for having Sarah's love and life. With this idea in mind, James began to subtly plant evidence that would incriminate Mark. He used his skills as a photographer to create manipulated images that suggested an abusive relationship between Mark and Sarah. Anonymously, he leaked these images to the press and the police. He also began to sow doubts among the couple's acquaintances. In seemingly casual conversations, he would mention details about arguments he had witnessed between Mark and Sarah, exaggerating their intensity. He implied that Mark had a dark side that few knew about, and that Sarah had often confided in him her fears about her husband's temper. Inspector Reynolds and Sergeant Sanchez, although skeptical at first, could not ignore the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing towards Mark. Leaked photographs, testimonies from acquaintances about alleged fights, and inconsistencies in Mark's statements began to paint a bleak picture. Mark, feeling increasingly cornered, made the mistake of changing aspects of his story during interrogations. What had initially been small discrepancies attributable to stress now looked like deliberate lies in the eyes of the researchers. The pressure was breaking him, and James knew it. In an ironic twist of fate, it was James who suggested to the police that they search the woods near the city. Sarah loved nature, he told them with feigned innocence. If something happened to him, it could have been there. This tip led police directly to the area where he and Mark had buried Sarah's body months before. The discovery of Sarah's body marked a turning point in the investigation. An autopsy revealed that he had died from a blow to the head, consistent with a fall or a push. Fibers found on his clothing matched carpets in the Thompson home. Everything indicated that Sarah had died in her own home and that her body had subsequently been moved. With this new evidence, police obtained a search warrant for the Thompson home. Forensic analysis revealed traces of blood in the kitchen. Despite Mark and James' efforts to clean up the scene, the net was rapidly closing around Mark. Meanwhile, James played the role of the loyal friend to perfection. She accompanied Mark to police interviews, offered her support in public and private, all while continuing to fuel suspicions against him. His performance was so convincing that even Mark, in his most desperate moments, leaned on James without suspecting that he was the one orchestrating his downfall. The situation came to a head when the police decided to arrest Mark for formal questioning. The scene of the arrest was chaotic, with reporters and television cameras surrounding the Thompson home. Mark, pale and visibly upset, was handcuffed and taken to the police station before the astonished gaze of his neighbors. James, present at the time of the arrest, masterfully played the role of the shocked friend. With tears in his eyes, he told reporters that he couldn't believe what was happening, that Mark had always been a good man, and that there must be some mistake. His performance was so convincing that even Detectives Reynolds and Sanchez felt a pang of sympathy toward him. Mark's interrogation was long and exhausting. Hour after hour, the detectives pressed him, presenting the evidence accumulated against him. Mark, exhausted and terrified, finally broke down. Between sobs, he confessed to having pushed Sarah during an argument, accidentally causing her death. He described how, in a moment of panic, he had decided to hide the body with the help of James. Mark's confession was the final blow. He was formally charged with the murder of Sarah Thompson and taken into custody awaiting trial. The news spread like wildfire, shocking the community and generating headlines across the country. James, seemingly free of all suspicion, retreated to the solitude of his apartment. There, surrounded by photographs of Sarah and the memories he had kept, he finally allowed himself to celebrate his victory. In his deranged mind, he believed he had done justice for Sarah and eliminated the man who stood between them. However, James' victory would be short-lived. Sergeant Sanchez, driven by a hunch, decided to further investigate James' role in the entire story. Something about his behavior during Mark's arrest had left her uneasy. He began meticulously reviewing all of their statements, looking for inconsistencies or details they might have missed. It was during this review that Sanchez noticed something strange about the photographs that allegedly showed Mark's abuse of Sarah. Using advanced image analysis techniques, he discovered subtle signs of manipulation. The dates and times of some of the photos did not match the original metadata. Intrigued by this discovery, Sanchez expanded her research. He began tracking James' movements in the days after Sarah disappeared. To her surprise, she discovered that James had made several trips to the forest where the body was found, supposedly to take nature photographs. With these new suspicions, Sanchez convinced Inspector Reynolds to obtain a search warrant for James' apartment. What they found there was chilling. A shrine dedicated to Sarah took up an entire room. Photographs, some clearly taken without Sarah's knowledge, covered the walls. In a drawer they found Sarah's wedding ring and a lock of her hair, along with a diary full of disturbing fantasies about a life with her. The evidence was overwhelming. James was arrested and subjected to intense interrogation. Under the combined pressure of the physical evidence and the weight of his own guilt, James finally collapsed. He confessed his obsession with Sarah, his role in covering up her death, and how he had manipulated the situation to frame Mark. The revelation of the truth shook the community and the judicial system. Mark was immediately released, although the damage to his reputation and psyche had already been done. James, for his part, was charged with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence and complicity in the concealment of a homicide. The trial that followed was a media circus. The story of love, obsession, and betrayal captured the public's attention. James, once considered a loyal friend and talented artist, was now seen as an obsessive and dangerous manipulator. His testimony on the stand revealed the depth of his disorder, leaving the audience horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Mark, although legally exonerated, had to face the consequences of his initial actions. While he was not convicted of murder, he was still guilty of covering up Sarah's accidental death and lying to authorities. He received a reduced sentence, focused more on rehabilitation than punishment. The Thompson-Hartley case became one of the most infamous in modern British criminal history. It exposed the complexities of the justice system, the fragility of human relationships, and the devastating consequences of obsession and betrayal. The media analyzed every detail, from the apparent perfection of the Thompson marriage to the double life of James Hartley. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case, fascinated by the psychological complexity of those involved. James's obsession became the subject of numerous studies on the dangers of unrequited love and personality disorders. Mark's reaction to Sarah's accidental death was analyzed as a classic example of decision-making under extreme stress. Years after the events, the impact of the case was still felt in the community and in the lives of those involved. Mark Thompson, after serving his sentence, tried to rebuild his life away from London. Guilt over Sarah's accidental death and his initial cover-up haunted him, leading him to dedicate his life to community service and advocacy for restorative justice. James Hartley, sentenced to 20 years in prison, became a case study for forensic psychiatrists. His obsession with Sarah, far from diminishing with imprisonment, seemed to intensify. He spent his days writing letters to Sarah that would never be sent, and creating elaborate fantasies about a life together that would never exist. Sergeant Elena Sanchez, whose persistence had been key to uncovering the truth, was promoted and became a respected cold case investigator. Her experience in the Thompson-Hartley case led her to specialize in crimes motivated by obsession and passion, becoming a recognized expert in the field. Inspector Jack Reynolds, deeply affected by how the case had challenged his initial assumptions, dedicated himself to improving investigation protocols in missing persons cases. His work led to significant changes in the way police approach these complex cases. The story of the Thompsons and James Hartley became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and even a television series. Each new interpretation of the facts revived the public debate about the limits of love, friendship, and obsession. For the residents of Oakwood Street, the Thompson home remained a somber reminder of the events that had shaken their quiet community. Although new tenants eventually moved in, neighbors never forgot the tragedy that had occurred behind those red brick walls. Sarah Thompson's death and the events that followed left an indelible mark on everyone involved. It was a story that challenged preconceived notions about love, loyalty, and human nature. It demonstrated how decisions made in moments of crisis can have far-reaching consequences, and how the line between love and obsession can be dangerously thin. For Mark Thompson, every day was a fight against regrets and what-ifs. In his moments of reflection, he wondered what his life would have been like if he had made different decisions that fateful night. What would have happened if I had called the emergency services immediately? How would everything have changed if he had been honest from the beginning? James Hartley, in the solitude of his cell, alternated between moments of lucidity in which he understood the magnitude of his actions and periods of delirium in which he continued to believe that everything he had done was out of love for Sarah. His therapy sessions revealed a deeply disturbed personality, shaped by experiences of rejection and abandonment in his past. The case also had a lasting impact on the legal system. It became a benchmark for similar cases, leading to a reevaluation of how missing persons investigations were handled and how circumstantial evidence was interpreted. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike studied the Thompson-Hartley case as an example of how appearances can be deceptive and how the truth can be more complex than it first appears. In academia, the case generated renewed interest in the study of criminal psychology. Research was conducted on the factors that can lead a seemingly normal person to commit acts of obsession and extreme manipulation. James Hartley's behavior, in particular, became the subject of intense scrutiny, leading to new theories about the intersection between love, obsession, and mental illness. The media, which had played a crucial role in how the case was perceived by the public, also came under scrutiny. The ethics of the sensational coverage and how it could have influenced the investigation and public opinion were questioned. This led to debates about the media's responsibility in covering high-profile criminal cases. As the years passed, the story of the Thompsons and James Hartley became something of a modern urban legend. It was told in bars, discussed in book clubs, and analyzed in criminology classes. Each new generation rediscovered it, finding in it lessons about the complexity of human nature and the dangers of uncontrolled emotions. For those who personally knew those involved, the tragedy never lost its emotional impact. Sarah Thompson's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter and the way her death had been manipulated, became advocates for reforms in the criminal justice system. They established a foundation in Sarah's memory, dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and educating about the signs of abusive relationships and obsessive behaviors. Sarah's co-workers at the architecture firm created a scholarship in her name, intended for promising young female architects. This gesture not only honored Sarah's memory, but also served as a constant reminder of the talent and potential that had been lost. As for the Oakwood Street community, the case left an invisible but deep scar. Neighbors, who had once prided themselves on living in a quiet, safe neighborhood, now looked askance at strangers and kept their doors locked. The trust that had once been the hallmark of the community had eroded, replaced by lingering wariness. However, over time, the community also found ways to heal and grow from the tragedy. Annual vigils were organized in memory of Sarah, which became a time of collective reflection and community unity. These events not only honored Sarah's memory, but also served as a reminder of the importance of watching for signs of abuse and obsession in relationships. The Thompson-Hartley case left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, a grim reminder of how appearances can be deceptive and how decisions made in times of crisis can have far-reaching consequences. But it also became a source of important lessons about the need for honesty in relationships, about the dangers of uncontrolled obsession, and about the importance of seeking help when emotions threaten to overwhelm us. Ultimately, the story of Mark, Sarah, and James became a modern parable about the complexities of love, friendship, and betrayal. A story that reminds us that even in the closest relationships, there can be dark secrets and unexpressed desires, and that sometimes our worst enemies are those who are closest to us. As the sun sets over Oakwood Street, shadows lengthen over the house that once belonged to the Thompsons. To casual passers-by, it's just another house on a quiet street. But for those who know the story, it is a silent monument to a tragedy that forever changed the lives of everyone involved. A reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, passions and secrets can lurk that can destroy entire worlds.